Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse number 27. Matthew 5, beginning in verse 27. Oh, by the way, this is obviously the last lesson that you have in your booklet. I just copied lessons 26, 27, and 28. I haven't separated them and hole punched them. But next week I will be in Sevierville for polishing the pulpit, and Josh Taylor from Fayette will be here in my place morning and night. And so you don't worry about us being finished. I will do my best to have the lessons on the table before I leave on Wednesday. I'll be leaving, Lord willing, Wednesday. I won't be home until Thursday week. But I'll try to have those lessons ready to pick up and put in your notebook by this Wednesday. But don't worry, they'll certainly be ready by time for us the next time we run through this material. So you'll have 3 more lessons to put in with respect to the series. All right, Matthew 5, beginning in verse 27. Jesus said, "You've heard that it is said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whosoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members should perish than your whole body be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it's more profitable for you for one of your members to be lost than your whole body to be cast into hell. Furthermore, it's been said that whosoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whosoever divorces his wife, except it be for, depending on your rendering, sexual immorality or fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whoso marries her who is divorced commits adultery." And so I want to think about this as an entire text, beginning with the matter of lust, and then concluding with the matter of divorce. I had made mention that I've started a series on the fundamentals. Of course, last week the fundamental of the necessity of baptism to be in the body of Christ and be in His blood, the one church. And I had intended to talk about the fundamentals of marriage and divorce, but because we're studying it here, I'm going to move it further down into the series. We'll talk about the inspiration of the Bible starting, Lord willing, this morning. But this is a very important text, obviously for a number of reasons. Number one, it's in the very first sermon that Jesus is recorded. It's not the first sermon He preached, but it is the first sermon that we have recorded by Jesus. Also, the predominant thinking of the Jewish people with regard to marriage and divorce had drifted a long way from God's original plan for divorce. In fact, we don't read anything about divorce in our Bibles for hundreds of years after. We don't have any indication of divorce, for example, in any time up to the flood, which was 1651 years from the time of creation. And then we don't have anything that Moses says about divorce until the book of Deuteronomy. In other words, all the Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, that's not to say there wasn't divorce. Because if there wasn't divorce, Moses wouldn't even have written about it in Deuteronomy 24. And so we do know that divorce, or that some type of severing of the marriage bond had been taking place in the lives of Israel. And so Moses is writing in Deuteronomy 24 a regulation for the Jews to help regulate their practice, because there had been nothing written for them up to that point in time. And so we want to understand, first of all, that divorce has never been God's intention. It's always been God's intention that a man and a woman be married until death separates them. Jesus said as much in Matthew 19. I just preached this very material a week ago Wednesday up in Hillsborough, Tennessee. They gave me the subject and this text of Jesus and divorce. And there are three statements. There are three statements of Jesus as recorded in the Scriptures with regard to divorce, and this is the first one. The second one is in Matthew 19 and verse 4 through 9. The third one is not in red letters, it's in black letters. But Paul says Jesus said it in 1 Corinthians 7 verses 10 and 11. He says, now to the married I command, yet not I but the Lord. And then he goes on to say that let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she departs, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. And so these are the three express statements. Now, obviously, there are parallel accounts to Matthew's statement in Matthew 19. Obviously, the exact same account is in Mark chapter 10 and also in the book of Luke. But these are the three distinct times that Jesus is mentioned as speaking of divorce. And Jesus says, Moses permitted you because of the hardness of your hearts to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. In other words, Jesus goes all the way back to the creation. From the beginning it was not so. And so he affirms what God's plan for marriage has always been. One man, one woman until death separates them. Paul spoke to that same effect in Romans chapter 7. You know that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. And he goes on to talk about the marriage bond, that if a woman divorces her husband and she's married to another, she'll be called an adulteress. But if her husband is dead, she is no longer an adulteress, though she be married to another man. And Paul only introduced that in order to reaffirm and reinforce the idea that the law of Moses was dead. In other words, he took a statement of fact about marriage, and then he applied it to the new covenant. He says, likewise, you reckon yourselves also to be dead to the law, so that you might be joined or married to another, even Christ. And so we have a number of statements about marriage, and sometimes they're particular about marriage, and sometimes they illustrate other Bible truths. And in Paul's case in Romans 7, that all of the law of Moses is dead. It's all dead. That's another thing people have a hard time wrapping their heads around. Some people say, well, most of the law of Moses is dead, but the first 10 are still alive. That won't work. For example, in Romans chapter 7, Paul said, you are dead to the law that you might be joined to another, even Christ. That's in verses 1 through 4. Then down in verse 6 he said, I would have not known covetousness except the law says thou shalt not covet. All right? And so the same law that Paul talks about, the same law that governs marriage, he says, that he quotes is the same law that governs covetousness. The law. All right? Well, guess what? There's only one place in all the Old Testament that says thou shalt not covet. And guess where it is? The Ten Commandments. And so the same law that governed marriage is the same law that said thou shalt not covet. And Paul said that law is dead. Now that doesn't mean we get to covet, and that's why we're going to come back to this text. That's by the way, that's the common objection to saying that the Ten Commandments are dead or invalid. Oh, well, now you're saying you can commit adultery, you can commit murder, you can take the name of the Lord in vain, you can do this, you can do that. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying the law that said that is dead. But we have another law now, and that's the law that we're studying right now, the law of Christ. And as we noted last week, the law of Christ draws a distinction between... wait. The law of Christ erases the distinction between thinking about a thing and doing it. See, the old law says you're only an adulterer if you do what? Commit it. But Jesus said you commit adultery if you what? Thinking. if you think it. Same thing we've already studied about murder, right? The only way you can be a murderer under the old law is to do what? Kill somebody, right? But under the new covenant, Jesus said you're a murderer what? If you hate your brother without cause, or you're angry with your brother without cause. John said, whosoever hates his brother is a murderer, 1 John 3:15. And so Jesus erases the distinction between the act itself and the motivation of the heart that causes the act. And so, as I said, the law of Christ is, in my mind, the law of Christ is far more difficult to follow because it's far easier for me to govern my actions than it is for me to govern my mind. Now, I don't know if you think the same way. It may be not. I'm just saying, for me, the law of Christ is far more difficult because it's harder for me to control my thoughts than it is for me. I mean, it's like think about all the times you just wanted to strangle somebody. Just snatch them up, right? Just snatch them up. Under the old law, you wouldn't be guilty unless you snatched them up. Under the new law, that right there is going to get you every time, right? And so that's why Paul talked about bringing every thought into captivity under Christ in 2 Corinthians. That we, if we can learn to govern this and learn to control this, the rest of it will take care of itself, right? And so to me, the law of Christ is a far more stringent law than the law of Moses. And so now let's look at in the lesson itself. He talks about, and by the way, I mentioned this, and by the way, in the second paragraph under the introduction, let me draw your attention to something. It says, look around in any given community, approximately 50% of the people come from split homes. For a long time, the statistical reality is that half of all marriages end in divorce. Okay, that half of all marriages end in divorce. But that is not the same thing as saying that half the people who marry get divorced. Those two things are not the same. Now let me explain. Now, some of you young folks don't remember a guy by the name of Mickey Rooney. But some of us remember Mickey Rooney. See, all of us old grayheads remember. Vince, you old enough to remember Mickey Rooney? I'm trying to figure out where the age gap is. Yeah, a little short dude back in the day. A little comedian, comedian. All right? Y'all don't have any idea. All right. Now, I'll try to make it. Jen? No? How about this? Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor? Because Elizabeth Taylor's time's a little bit after Mickey Rooney's. But the reason I mentioned both of those is because between the two of them, they married 18 times. Mickey Rooney married 9 times, and I think Elizabeth Taylor married 9 times. All right? And so now what do you got to figure? If half of all marriages end in divorce, what do you got to have to offset that? 18 marriages still intact. Is that right? If half of all marriages end in divorce and these two've piled up 18 divorces amongst them, that means there's got to be 18 corresponding marriages that are still intact. That's why it's not accurate to say that half of the people who marry divorce. Because, look, we even know people around here, 2, 3, 4-time losers in the marriage game, right? All right, well, for everyone, so for every one of those, there has to be a marriage still intact. Statistically speaking, 70% of all people who marry remain married. All right? But you never hear that statistic. All right? And so we want to make sure that we understand that marrying is not a 50-50 proposition of success. In reality, it's a 70% chance of success, and among Christians, it's better than that. All right, when Christians marry Christians, it's better than that. And so I want you to understand that a lot of what we've been told is statistically correct, but practically it is not. So I don't want you to have a misguided understanding about the odds of staying married. Once you're married. All right. So, but it is true in the last part of that same paragraph that adultery and divorce literally ruin people's lives, and there is much confusion about it today. All right. And so Jesus says in verses 27 and 28, you've heard it's been said, you shall not commit adultery. By the way, that is what is called the seventh commandment. It says, but I say to you that whosoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so now, it's pretty straightforward. But we also noted last week, I believe it was, I know I preached this at Hillsboro, that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to prove such a thing in order to secure a divorce. In other words, I've been asked through house to house many times, my husband has a pornography problem. Can I divorce him? Can I divorce him and remarry based on? And by the way, they go to Matthew 5:27-28. If he has a pornography problem, then he obviously has a lust problem. And he has a lust problem that involves some woman or women that are not his wife. And then the question is, can I divorce my husband and remarry? And my answer has always been no. Because of what Jesus said in Matthew 19:9 and the way it is said. I think Jesus requires an act involved, as opposed to trying to judge somebody's heart. When we start trying to get into the heart judging business, well, you want to talk about opening up Pandora's box. But it's always far easier to judge a person's actions than it is obviously to try to presume to know their heart. And so I've always said that such is not grounds for divorce, and also just because of what how high God holds marriage in His law. And so people might disagree with me, but I'm just telling you that's what I tell people when it could, but not necessarily always, because of the nature of it. Because of the nature of it. Let me just address that just for a second. All right. Ann talked about that pornography could lead to the act. Back in the 70s, when they really began to be lax in the pornography laws, the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of what we call decency laws, obscenity laws, pornography laws. As those things began to be loosened, the accusation was that the proliferation of pornography would almost lead to an explosion in men of them turning into rapists. That was the conventional thinking at the time, and it was completely wrong. It was completely wrong. That what happened with the proliferation of pornography and the loosening of obscenity laws is that men withdrew themselves from their own wives because they were finding gratification through their eyes in what they could see in magazines and online. And what you find many times is that men that have problems with pornography don't have anything to do with their wives, for a number of reasons. But one of the things is that most women involved in pornography don't weigh 400 pounds. All right? Well, look. Don't golly me. Don't golly me.
What I've got going on in my mind thinking about that, okay? You're wrong.
They don't find the biggest, fattest, ugliest women on the planet to participate in pornography.
I can clean that up. All right.
There ain't nothing to clean up. There's nothing to clean up. It's a fact. And so what men are seeing in that environment is not relatable to what they're living with every day, and therefore they're rejecting the women that they're married to in exchange for what goes on in their mind in a magazine or on a screen or on their phone. And so the conventional thinking was wrong. It was wrong. I mean, not only was it wrong, it was the very opposite. It was the very opposite of what they said would happen. And so again, the problem of, and I'm just going to close it out with this. The problem of pornography is far worse than most of you probably imagine. Probably far worse than.
I figured you did. All right, a natural way of putting that. All right, this is a country version. All right, there's a difference in corn-fed and overfed.
Corn-fed and overfed? I don't think that's any better.
Well, if the story had been the wife and 180 or whatever, the story would have been much better, and what's his face would have written away.
Yeah, he'll just have to deal with it. I'm just telling you what the facts are.
Well, they use
Because look, and it's not. Yeah, they're trying to use the picture of the.
They can Photoshop it to be her.
That's exactly right.
So you go from looking at the perfect body to
The one you're married to.
who's not going to have a perfect.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. By the way, how many ugly women are there in country music? Used to be a lot. That's right. But how many are there now? How many ugly women are there in country music? I'll tell you how many. Zero. And you would think, just by looking at it, that ugly women can't sing. But that's not the point. What's the point? The point is the sexuality of the matter takes precedent in many cases over the talent. Look, two women equally talented singers. One, on a scale of 1 to 10, one of them's a 9 and one of them's a 3. Who do you think gets the record deal? Why? Because of the visual part of it. All right, and so we just got to be honest about the matter. By the way, that's the way God made us. God made men far more visual than women, far more visual than women, so far as their brains are concerned. And so that's why 90-something% of all pornography is geared toward men, and less than 10% is geared toward women. It's just a fact. All right, but the whole thing goes back to the matter of the heart. The matter of the heart. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. And then you get to verses 29 and 30, where he talks about if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Now, obviously, Jesus is not endorsing personal mutilation in order to maintain purity. But what he is saying is this: you better do everything that you possibly can. You better do everything that you possibly can to keep from sinning. In other words, so whatever it takes is what we need to do. And so, well, just by way of example, again, the lamp or the light of the body is the eye. If your eye is good, your body will be filled with light. If your eye is evil, your body will be filled with darkness. Matthew 6, verses 22 and 23. Things that you let into your mind and your heart through your eye can never be erased. That's why it's so important to, especially for men and young men, to guard what they watch. on television or in movies or music videos, or that was a big thing when John and I were teenagers, was the sexualization of the music videos. It wasn't about the music, it was about the video. There was no such thing as a heavy metal video that wasn't filled with beautiful women, right? By the way, if you watch country music videos, you see the exact same thing. You see the exact same thing. And yet we will mindlessly watch these things and act as if they don't affect us. But they do, because whatever you put in your brain is there forever. And by the way, you may never think of it for another 20 or 30 years, but something will happen at some point in time, and you'll see something, hear something, smell something. And that image comes right back, something you've not thought about for 20 years, 30 years. And by the way, I'm old enough to say 30 years, maybe even 40 years. Comes right, and you don't have any control over it. You put it in your brain when you were 16, and now you're 50-something, not having thought of it for 40 years, and then there it is again. That's what Jesus is teaching us here, is that we have to do everything we possibly can to guard our hearts, and we have to guard our hearts by guarding our eyes, especially where men are concerned. And then verses 31 and 32, where Jesus says, you've heard it said, or furthermore it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now this is the premise behind Matthew 19. He says, but I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except it be for fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whoso marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Now, just quickly fast forward to Matthew 19. The Pharisees come to Jesus and they say, is it lawful for us to put away our wives, for a man to put away his wife for just any reason? And Jesus said, no. No. It's not. So he said. Then they said, well, then why did Moses command us to give her a certificate of divorcement to put her away? That was a misrepresentation of Moses. Moses didn't command them to put away their wives. Jesus corrected him. He says, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to put away your wives. He didn't command it. He said he permitted it because your hearts were hard. It says, but from the beginning it has not been so. And then Jesus goes back to what he says here in Matthew 5, 31 and 32. Whoever divorces his wife, except it be for fornication, and marries another commits adultery. Whoso marries her that is put away commits adultery. I mean, look, that passage is not that hard to understand. And by the way, let me just add this. Matthew 19:9 is not God's law on marriage. God's law on marriage is Matthew 19:4. Have you not read that he that made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. That's God's law on marriage. Stay married. The exception to God's law on marriage is Matthew 19:9. In other words, God understands, because God's the creator of marriage. There's no evolutionary explanation for marriage. All right, God's law on marriage, or God gave us marriage. Therefore, God understands marriage better than anybody, and He understood that to break the marriage bond in a sexual way could be so devastating, so as to not be able to be overcome. He doesn't say it's always that way. He says it can be that way. Or you could have a situation where one partner has no intention of being faithful to the marriage bond, and thus permits the innocent party to put away the guilty party. Right? But that's God's exception to the rule. The rule is get married and stay married till one of you dies.
One guilty person can marry three people's wives.
Oh man!
Or multiple
Yeah, one guilty person can ruin 3 people's lives. That's exactly right. Because you destroy your marriage, and then you destroy the marriage of the next person, or you destroy the life of the next person that you end up with. And that's
or the person that they end up with.
Right. And that's what Jesus
committing adultery with the person. You just got this out of hand, and it can't be drawn back.
Right. Now, Lord willing, in 2 Sundays, obviously we're going to come back to this, but I want to spend some time in 2 weeks dealing with the oneness principle. Because when you start talking about marriage and divorce and remarriage and all of it, and what is adultery, what constitutes adultery, again, what is adultery, what constitutes adultery, or does adultery continue? The understanding of the oneness principle is critical. It's critical, and we'll talk. We're going to talk at some length about. Is that the first one? Okay. First one. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, the reason there's not as many divorces now as there used to be is because people are living together outside of marriage, and so therefore there's no divorces involved when people are living together. By the way, the fact that the largest and fastest growing group of people who are living together outside of marriage are people over the age of 65. That may surprise you. It ain't young people, Furman, it's old people. It's old people. Now, why? That's a statistical fact. The largest and fastest growing group of people living together outside of marriage are people over 65. Now, why is that? That's exactly right. People don't want to lose their Social Security benefits by getting married, so they just shack up so they can have more money, which is why the government ought to have no business in the marriage business. The government ought to have no business in the marriage business. I mean, the government is incentivizing sin. It's just like the welfare system in the 60s. They started incentivizing sin, children out of wedlock. And when you incentivize a thing, you're going to get a lot more of it. And so, the government ought to just keep its nose out of the marriage business. But also this, and I had to speak on this at Paulson Pulpits probably 7 or 8 years ago at least. Statistically speaking, if you live together before you marry, you are 70% more likely to divorce. Do you know that? People talk about living together as a trial run to determine compatibility. If you live with somebody before you marry them, you're 70% more likely to divorce than if you follow God's plan. And by the way, that's not even with any respect to religious, ideas on the part of the participants. All right, we'll start bottom of page 1 and start talking about actually we'll just start at the top of page 2 because it starts with what is adultery, and that's the key to understanding. So that'll be the 27th.